Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and we publish it in seasons of 5 to 10 episodes every couple months. This is the beginning of season 3, which is all about impact tracking. How can we manifest the meme of impact equals profit? What are the most interesting experiments in ideas in impact tracking? How can we build crypto economic systems that elevate impactful builders? And how do we move from virtue signaling to crypto economic proof of virtue? These are the themes of GreenPilled Impact Season 2024. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at greenpill.network, where you can download the GreenPilled Book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local greenpill.network chapter. My guests for this episode are Carl and Jonas from Optimism. And I am really excited to talk to them about the kickoff of GreenPilled Impact Season. Jonas is the lead for retroactive public goods funding at Optimism, which is distributing about $20 to $30 million per season of funding for retroactive public goods funding in the Optimism ecosystem. Carl brings a career of impact tracking, from traditional impact tracking to working on hypercerts and Gitcoin and Optimism, and now OS Observer is his new project. And so in this episode, we kind of put our thoughts together, our ideas together, and we talk about what impact tracking is going to look like as the Ethereum ecosystem matures, as we have Gitcoin grants rounds, as we have retroactive public goods funding rounds. And Carl is going to be joining me for the remainder of the season as a co-host, talking to various guests about what impact tracking will look like in 2024 in the Ethereum and Web3 ecosystem. I feel like we're on the precipice of something huge, and that's why we're doing our first thematic season for GreenPill on impact tracking. There are, for the first time, standards that are coming online in the form of Ethereum attestation service and hypercerts that are allowing different applications to modularize and track the impact that they're creating, and then consume impact that other applications are producing. We are bootstrapping demand for impact tracking with Optimism retroactive public goods funding, with Gitcoin, with Giveth, with ClearFund. There is now tens of millions of dollars per year that is flowing into these markets. And Carl teaches us during this episode that impact tracking is a three-sided market. Projects that are creating impact, funders that are rewarding impact, and people who are evaluating impact. So a three-sided market that is being bootstrapped by Optimism and Gitcoin. So now that we have more data about which projects are actually creating impact, we can move from a Keynesian beauty contest to actually rewarding the projects that truly have impact. A Keynesian beauty contest is this idea where judges are rewarded for selecting the most popular faces across all of the selections, as opposed to the best participants. So how do we move from a Keynesian beauty contest to actually impact tracking? So I'm really excited about GreenPill Season 3 because I've got GigaBrains here on this episode to help me kick off the season. Carl will be co-hosting the episodes with us, and we're going to do a couple experiments in the formatting of the GreenPill podcast, in that we're going to be dropping these thematic episodes. We are also now doing collectible versions of each episode. So during season 3, we are experimenting with pods.media. So all episodes are going to be available on chain, allowing the GreenPill community to collect and own these episodes. Proceeds will go directly to support public goods, and collectors can vote on future episodes and other fun perks for supporting GreenPill. Go to pods.media/GreenPill to find all those episodes and to start collecting. There will be a link in the show notes. So GreenPill Season 3 kicks off right now. We are talking about impact tracking. Without further ado, I give you Jonas and Carl. Enjoy. Alrighty. What's up, gentlemen?
Hey, Kevin. Hey, Jonas.
What's up, Owocki?
Great to have you here. Maybe we'll lead with a quick intro. Carl, you want to go first?
Yeah, so my name is Carl. I'm working on a project called Open Source Observer, co-founder of Greenpill Labs. Before that, I was working on a protocol called hypercerts, which was being developed by Protocol Labs. And previously, before that, I did a lot of things in the kind of traditional world of impact measurement and looking at how to help Fortune 500 companies measure impact, helping governments and nonprofits measure impact. So that's a lot where my background is, and then been quite excited to get involved in the new world of decentralized public goods funding.
Thanks, Carl. Jonas, you want to give a quick intro?
Sure. I'm Jonas. I'm contributing to the Optimism Collective, and there I'm trying to make this thing called retroactive public goods funding happen, which is super exciting. We just closed the voting for the third round of it, and we're hoping to do many more iteration cycles. So my days are kind of spent worrying and thinking about all the different pieces that go into making RetroPGF happen.
Well, I see a lot of reflections of what Gitcoin's been doing in retroactive public goods funding, so I probably have a lot of the same anxieties as you, Jonas. I want to talk about impact measurement in this episode. I'm wondering if we can use Gitcoin and RPGF as needles that we can thread. So can you tell me big picture what you want to do with RPGF, and then we can maybe back into impact tracking from there?
Sure. Let me try to find the big picture. The idea is essentially we retroactively reward people for the impact they had, for the contributions they made to the Optimism Collective. And this could be all kinds of different impact that is rewarded here. This could be everything from building super useful tooling for developers, contributing to the open stack, onboarding new users, etc. This is what we want to do. The end game of this looks like that we're super accurate in tracking and measuring impact. And we get to build a machine that becomes super reliable in rewarding this impact. And so it becomes almost like a market-like dynamic to create impact. And if you create impact, you know that you will receive these rewards based on the impact measurement. And then the big future of this is we get we have tens of thousands of contributors being able to contribute to this great decentralized protocol called Optimism. And there's essentially, and it's all done through this democratic voting system that decides on the parameters of RetroPGF.
So it feels like we're kind of trying to approach this meme of impact equals profit, where the median participant in the Optimism ecosystem knows that if they create impact, they'll be rewarded at some point in the future for it. Is that too reductionist?
I think that is 100% what we're up to. I think the larger point is how do we build, right? The journey we're all on is how do we build these reward mechanisms which are able to essentially allocate resources in a way that it facilitates the development of a whole ecosystem. So instead of relying on one foundation, let's say the Optimism Foundation or other foundations and other ecosystems to become a big grant giving body that facilitates a lot of development and finances it, can we get to something where we build decentralized democratic mechanisms that achieve the same goal and actually are more effective than any single entity could be?
Carl, I know that you've been involved in RPGF. Anything to add here?
One of the things that I think is really incredible about what the team at Optimism has done is created this heartbeat around these RetroPGF rounds that are happening. And so not only are you able to get this signal that there's going to be funding for impact, at the same time, you're starting to see what forms of impact the community cares most about. And ideally, that is going to really change the incentives so that people are going to be working on those things in anticipation of future RetroPGF. So the degree to which these experiments, they become a signal for people to keep building in a certain direction and kind of shifting what they work on because they want to get RetroPGF, I think will really just change the incentive landscape for people.
Yeah. The point that I heard there that I really want to dig in on is this idea that there's many different types of impact. I've had Gregory Landua on the show before, and he talks about the 8 different forms of capital. And if I tried to rattle them off there, I think it's financial capital, which I think is what crypto is sort of known for, spiritual capital, social capital, material capital, intellectual capital. I'm forgetting the other 2 or 3, but I'm wondering if Carl, in the work that you've done around impact measurement, how you sort of think about the different types of impact and creating a taxonomy of them and comparing and contrasting them with each other. And then maybe also how that applies to RPGF. Carl, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Let me take that. So I think first off, there's something which is very subjective about impact. So on the one hand, everybody's going to experience a public good in the way it interacts with them in a different way. And so we need to be able to capture that richness of experience. And so that's like the first challenge that we face. The second one is that typically impact measurement has really been the domain of like experts. So experts are able to come up with complex ways of rating things and scoring it. And it's very difficult to replicate that. And so I think the other challenge we face is how can we get experts to translate their views on what is a good public good or something that is impactful into a framework or into some kind of a rubric that others can actually build towards. I think if we can find that sweet spot between the right amount of qualitative and the right amount of kind of predictable or quantitative impact measurement, the more we can create a real signal for people to build towards.
Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to ask there is, I know that decentralization is a meme in Web3. Do you think that we'll always rely on experts?
I think that experts certainly have like a really valuable role to play, just given that they've spent so many years either studying a problem or working on it directly. And so I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. On the other hand, I think that if we believe that experts are the only ones that are qualified to assess something, then we're never going to be able to bring in new perspectives. So I really hope that the experts view their role as kind of creating a ladder for others to climb up, as opposed to being the first ones to figure something out and then pulling up the ladder so that others aren't able to follow in their footsteps.
Jonas, anything to add here?
Might be kind of a rabbit hole take here, but I think the more complex a kind of impact evaluation methodology doesn't make it necessarily be a better method to achieve the goal. So I think one counterintuitive thing that I stumbled upon at some point was we already live in a world where we use a bunch of simple measurements to do a bunch of resource allocation. And so like one of my favorite examples is something like Spotify pays artists based on the number of streams, right? Which is a super simple way to evaluate impact. And it's probably not like the best one, right? But this is like the current system, how this current system simply functions. And I think to this point, right, it's like, so our goal is not necessarily to be like the most exhaustive in creating 1,000 or 1,000,000 different measurements and tick boxes for experts to check. I think our goal is actually to find something simple that has super high signal. And so I think like Carl has specifically explored this landscape super well and trying to understand like with the existing data, for instance, that we have today, how can we come up with like simple signals that describe the impact? And the really interesting observation here is the better we do this and the more we evolve from this, I think the more we can move away from like heavily expert reliant systems. But as Carl said, right, like we're very early in doing this. So a kind of dual approach of like expert-based evaluation and like pre-existing data from other sources makes a lot of sense.
I think that's a profound framework for me to think about Spotify rewarding artists based off the number of streams as retro funding based off of impact. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I wonder if there's other simple examples out there of sort of impact funding based off of simple metrics like that. Simplicity feels like it's a feature here, not a bug, because simple means comprehensible by anyone.
Yeah, I think what you certainly want to see is people having a very clear idea of what impact is and that it'll be rewarded, but it can actually be very difficult to attain. So the fact that you get paid based on views or you get paid based on listens doesn't mean that it's straightforward to crack that algorithm and to find a way to get lots of people to listen to your music or watch your video. So I think that's really the difficult problem space here is figuring out metrics that are motivating and simple, but at the same time difficult to game.
Yeah, and that difficult to game thing, I feel like we're packing a lot in there as well. The example that's coming to mind for me, and maybe this isn't quite impact measurement, but it sort of reminds me of how food has evolved over the last 100 years. And as we've done more and more food science, we've invented Snickers bars and Airheads and these things that are over optimized for sugar because that's what we've been evolved to seek. But in the process, we've removed all the nutritious content a lot of out of the food. Jonas, you're in Europe. I'm in America. We might have a slightly different situation over here, but that's kind of what's coming to mind for me when I think about overfitting on a metric that maybe isn't the most nutritious, pun intended.
So it seems like this problem space is essentially like a needle in the haystack type thing where there's like 1,000 ways to get it wrong. And I think, right, like there are endless tales of like setting the wrong incentives. Even with good intentions, it's like very easy to end up in a space where you set the wrong incentives, and now everybody's eating like over sugared food all of a sudden. And I think we're very much in this space, which makes it a super interesting problem, but a super hard one. I think we already touched about like on complexities of like gameability of metrics, right? And then like what do these metrics mean if we do them in a very like repeated game style environment? And so I think the way to approach this really is we have to be really comfortable with making mistakes and learning from these mistakes. The likelihood is it will take us a lot of iterations to get this right. So there will be like a lot of bad incentives along the way, which we will need to learn from.
Yeah, that's one point that I just want to make sure that listeners hear is that retroactive public goods funding is a repeated evolutionary game in which each RPGF round is just taking a shot at the ultimate end goal, which is too reductionist, but I view as impact equals profit. And then you sort of go through this OODA loop where you observe the results and you design the next experiment and you iterate forward. And this is always how I've viewed Gitcoin as well, is that it's protopian in that it gets better every epoch than it was the previous epoch. Gitcoin's done 19 rounds now, and I guess maybe there's a couple that have been 2 steps forward and 2 steps back and then 1 step forward. But that's the kind of thing that happens when you try to have this iterative evolutionary game and you try to improve in the iterative experiment. So that's one thing I would encourage listeners to think about is that it's not about any one experiment. It's about the line of the experiments and what you're learning from each of them. Jonas, anything to add to that point?
Yes, I think we're very much like on the same journey here. We want to iterate on this a lot. I think the most reductionist way to describe this problem that probably a lot of people understand is you can think of this as like we're doing airdrops, right? And instead of the airdrop criteria being whatever criteria is set, like transacting addresses, or if people delegated tokens, or if people ever donated to a Gitcoin round, we try to come up with essentially more high signal criteria for these airdrops, in which we say these types of contributions with this type of impact should receive this amount. And so I think if you only think about the airdrop problem and then you try to essentially do really sophisticated airdrops, intuitively you get a pretty good understanding of what impact measurement is about and like all the pitfalls we can run into.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'd like to advocate for, both in like the context of what Gitcoin has done and what Optimism is doing as well, is the idea of actually kind of setting out with some hypothesis that you want to test through the experiment. So it's one thing doing things that you really want to test and see the outcome. It's another thing just trying a bunch of approaches blindly and not really knowing which one is going to work. So the degree to which we can figure out what exactly do we want to test and see if we're able to instrument a better outcome will be really helpful in kind of improving the velocity of learning that we do here.
Yeah, and that's one point I want to focus on here is learning velocity. Jonas, you had an idea while we were at DevConnect that you shared with me. I'm wondering if you want to share it now that pertains to learning velocity.
Yes. In Istanbul during DevConnect, I found my new passion, which is pushing for like radical open learning and iteration. This is something that we're trying to do with RetroPGF. we're very aware this is like a long-term hard problem to solve. And so we're trying to take a super iterative experimental approach where for each round, we have some hypotheses. We test these hypotheses. We learn from the round, which leads us to like what we prioritize in the next iteration. And what we're trying to do is that this is super easily accessible to people to understand what were the hypotheses that we made, what were the design decisions that came out of this, what have we learned from the round. And one big unlock here was if we're all iterating towards this future, it's really high leverage if we all share these learnings. And we all become very public and open about the experiments that we've run and what we've learned from them. So we kind of build this collective knowledge and collective expertise of running these rounds. So I think what we're getting to here is that we're getting all these different experiments, be this Gitcoin or be this hypercerts or be this drips or a bunch of other mechanisms together and building kind of this collective knowledge base of how to approach different problems within impact measurement and grant funding mechanisms and programs in general.
I think it's really great that you've been pushing for that. I've actually just authored a post on the Gitcoin Gov forums entitled Learning in Public and instituting a culture in which if we spend more than 20K on a round, maybe we should be writing up a post about what we learned from that round. And, as someone who's been involved in the space for 6 years, it kind of feels I'm realizing natural for me to build in public, to learn in public. I don't mind making mistakes in public, but I think that there's a lot of when people are new to the space and they're used to being closed off and protective of trade secrets from closed source organizations, there's a little bit of unlearning that you have to do in order to be vulnerable enough to learn in public. And I think that by watching prominent people in the space do it together, it makes it safe for other people to join that movement. So hope to push increasing our learning velocity together forward with you.
I'm super excited, super stoked about this. I think a big part here is like being vulnerable, especially if you're in an environment where we talk about a lot of tokens that flow through these programs, and being vulnerable in an environment which has a lot of aspects of big public-facing communities and platforms like Twitter that are really good at like prioritizing and serving outrage. It sometimes feels overwhelming to individuals or to projects to be very vulnerable and open about their mistakes and be radical in the experiments that they're running. And I think if we can foster or I think if we can just extend the kind of public learning culture that we have already, that will allow us to run many more fast-paced experiments than if we have a culture that is like very risk averse.
I totally agree. And, I think the profound point here is that if we're going to run these rounds every quarter or every 6 months in perpetuity, then over time, the faster the learning velocity is, the faster we're going to achieve that approaching the global maxima of impact equals profit or funding public goods. And so adjusting our learning velocity now, when it's only 2023, is going to make a big difference, assuming that this ecosystem continues into 2027 and in 2020 and 2030. Small adjustments to the learning velocity can compound a lot over time. All right. Well, it feels like we're sort of at the end of that thread of conversation. I'm wondering if I can take a quick pivot and we can re-anchor on you, Carl. Your career I see as doing impact measurement in the traditional world, and then you've been a Gitcoin steward, and then you've done hypercerts, and you've done RPGF, and now you're doing OS Observer. So I'm wondering if you can kind of take me from impact measurement in the old world into impact measurement in Web3. What are some themes that you've seen? What do you think Web3 has to learn from the old world? And if we're what should we not throw the baby out with the bathwater with respect to impact measurement and with what you learned in the old world? If you could just tell us a little bit about that progression, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think the thing that gets me most excited about the space that we're creating right now is that we can all see public goods that are important in our everyday lives in the world around us. And at the same time, we have this new construct of digital public goods, which right now, we don't really have good governance for them. We don't really have recurring funding models. And yet, as our digital lives grow more important, these forms of digital public goods are going to become increasingly as important, if not more important, than the role that like physical public goods play in our everyday life. So the question that I'm most preoccupied with is how do we actually take the good things from the legacy world and bring some of those forward and create like a digital equivalent of those, and not have to go through the same 1,000 years of history where we learned all the things that didn't work. And we don't have to go through those same kind of mistakes. We can actually speed run a lot of that learning. So some of the things that you already mentioned here, like learning in public and being willing to experiment, quickly throw something away without there being any ego or sense of pride associated with that, and move on to the next thing, are so important. And I think even though decentralization makes everything harder, like it is so much more difficult to do a grants round in the way that Gitcoin does it or in the way that Optimism does it, because you have so many stakeholders that need to be brought into the process. If you turn the thing on and no one shows up, then it didn't, it failed to serve its purpose. So there's so much more community building and I guess stakeholder alignment which is required along the way. But once you're able to do that, then number one, you've created legitimacy along the way. Number two, you've kind of created buy-in for the entire thing that you're doing. And number three, all these people now actually really care deeply about it being successful. And so you see that take shape in so many different forms, which I think are completely unique about how we're going about funding digital public goods. One example, which I love, is that because during RPGF, everything was being built on top of attestations. If someone didn't like the front end, if someone didn't know where to go for data, they could just go directly to the source. They could build their own front end. They could do their own thing with the attestation data, which was sitting there for anybody to access. And so if you kind of contrast that with the traditional world, where these things aren't only kind of locked up or hard to access, but they're actually viewed as like proprietary or things that you don't want other people to look at, you get a completely different type of building and way that people are actually supporting each other and collaborating. And so I think that right now, even though, again, this makes everything a bit more difficult to get going, I think it is the most powerful moat that we can create around these funding structures and these communities for funding digital public goods. And so seeing that now take root in a number of different ecosystems and being something where each one is learning from the next one and trying to take those lessons that were learned at Gitcoin and take some of that and bring new ideas through RPGF. And then as other ecosystems try and do their own version of RPGF, figure out which part they want to borrow, which part they want to innovate on. It's just so powerful. So I really hope that more institutions that are kind of in the traditional legacy world are able to look at this and see some source of inspiration. And at the same time, I hope we have the humility to look at a few things that we like from the legacy world and pick those up and try and implement our own version as we fund digital public goods.
Thanks, Carl. Jonas, you want to react to that? Yes,
I just want to. I think Carl's writing is probably a phenomenon that he's your favorite region's favorite region kind of thing. I've gotten a lot of like a lot from going through what Carl has published over the last few months. I would be curious, Carl, right? Like you went through essentially building hypercerts together with the hypercerts team, which is essentially this kind of contribution tracking tool. And now you're on the forefront of gathering a lot of data for impact measurement. Could you maybe talk a bit about like what is this impact measurement problem, and you've worked on this a lot over the past few months, past year, past career. What are like the most interesting, challenging aspects you found going into this rabbit hole?
Yeah, so when it comes to impact measurement, I used to, like in my previous life, I sat in the privileged role of having very specialized knowledge that would allow me to approach a company or an organization and charge a premium for that service. I could go in, I could look at what they were doing, and then basically find a way to measure impact and get them to respond to that in a way that would effectively result in them spending a lot of money. So it's basically a specialized set of skills that allows you to come in, measure impact, and then get someone to respond and change course based on your assessment. And so I think in this world, the problems that I think are most interesting are number one, how do you expand that opportunity so that as many people as possible can participate. So as many people as possible can look at what a project is doing, review the work, come up with an assessment as to whether they think that work is impactful or legitimate or credible or whatever metric you want to apply against it. And then at the same time, use that information to inform voting or funding decisions. Effectively, any impact assessment is a way of saying, I think this work is good, and therefore I think there should be more funding or more people working towards it. Right now, we are used to experts telling us what are the most important things to fund. We are used to not having access to the information or the data that will allow you to make your own assessment. I think it's going to take time before more people build that instinct where they can feel comfortable going in and trying to do that kind of bottom-up impact measurement. But I think that that's really the end goal here, is if we're able to make it so that people who are affected by various forms of public goods feel that they have a governance role by rating the impact of these things, by deciding which ones they think should have more funding and more attention, then that is one of the most important things that you can express. And so I think that we're starting to build out some of the tools that we can use in the form of attestations, in the form of a culture where everybody is working in public, where everybody is doing things open source. And the more we can do that, the more entirely new possibilities open up, like being able to trace the impact of, say, a software library all the way downstream to every app that is using it and every user that is interacting with that. Those are things that are possible uniquely in the world of digital public goods, but historically were very, very difficult to do in traditional supply chains, even though some of the dynamics are similar.
I just want to say what a treat it is to have been reading your Medium posts and your Gov posts about retro PGF. The first thing that drew me in was the beautiful charts and visualizations, the data porn. But now having this background, knowing that this was actually a specialized skill set that you were using in order to pull in probably multi-million-dollar contracts, and I'm just getting it for free by reading the Gitcoin Gov forum and the Optimism Gov forum, is really special. So we'll have a link to some of your posts in the show notes, Carl. Jonas, I don't know if you wanted to react to anything Carl said.
I might throw out like a weird example of where I think what Carl is doing and what Carl is describing in terms of impact measurement really changes how we can set incentives. So one example of, like, we often discuss in the end, I think like a good quote here was, Ethereum is kind of this economic test net where we can test new stuff before we actually ship it to the real world, before we ship it to governments and other entities that could use what we're building. And one example that I sometimes think about is the state-funded media in Germany. So there's essentially everyone in Germany that is registered here. For each apartment, you have to pay a monthly subscription to the state media. It's not voluntary. You have to pay it. And then there's this big resource allocation mechanism where there's essentially a bunch of committees which are elected by parliament deciding on which media programs, which entertainment is funded and which is not. This leads to, and it's all proactive funding, so it leads sometimes to like weird situations. So for instance, I as a consumer of that media realize that a lot of it is produced for like older generations who watch TV, right? The movies that I'm getting are not really for my kind of audience group. The movies sometimes have weird incentives because the committees are localized. They go to like each local committee and get buy-in from them, which means all of a sudden the plot of the movie is taking place in like 4 or 5 different regions, so they can get the grant funding of all the different regional committees. And this is essentially a problem because you're not great at measuring what is the actual impact of all this media that we're producing. Right? There's no way for me actually to signal well if I like a show, if I don't like a show. It's pretty much like an expert committee that is sitting there and like thinking about how they assess this impact. And a really interesting switch would be, if you think about it, is like, can we have bottom-up impact measurement in the system where the people consuming the media can actively signal if they value this piece of media that they consume or not, and how important it is to them. And then you could switch this around to like and all the committees, and most of the media is just retro funded. Now just thrown out a really, really weird rabbit hole example, but I think the switch from going to something where consumers essentially of these public goods actively get to signal what they value and what they don't value, and all the allocation, like the resource allocation decisions are made based on this, is a really powerful change from what Carl describes as a very like expert top-down driven system.
Yeah, let me actually continue that thread because I think it's very interesting. One of the things that we're now able to do is look at an ecosystem like Gitcoin and see the products are funded there, and then look at an ecosystem like Optimism, RPGF, and see the overlap of products that are also receiving funding from Optimism. And it'll be very interesting to kind of compare which products are viewed as more or less popular, impactful, worthy of funding in those two ecosystems. And I think, like you described, that there's going to be different ways of, number one, looking at the same thing, but assessing the value differently based on the context. In the case of Gitcoin, it might be more broad impact on the Ethereum ecosystem, whereas in the case of Optimism, it's supposed to be more focused on impact brought to the Optimism collective. Separately, you have a different set of voters and stakeholders who are looking at that. In Gitcoin, it's the whole world. In Optimism, it's 150 badge holders. And so increasingly, as we can start to take the same project, but experiment on different pools of funding, different voters, or different ways of deciding what to reward, and then different game mechanics as well, we're going to see very, very different outcomes. So I think that we're going to be learning much more about what people view as impactful, and at the same time, how to fund those things to produce more of them.
It feels like we're at the precipice of this being a really nascent, but also potentially very important design space in the future. Not only are there tens of millions of dollars going through retroactive public goods funding, quadratic funding experiments in Web3, but now we have primitives like EAS and Hypercerts and Gitcoin Grants Protocol, and these beautiful front ends that Optimism has commissioned for RPGF that can all start to be interoperable with each other. And we can start to really build movement around rewarding the things that actually have impact. And it feels like 2024 could be the year of impact tracking. That's why I wanted to do the impact season in this season of Greenpill. So, Carl, really excited to have you co-hosting a couple episodes with me this season, and I think that there's a lot of potential there. I'm wondering if you could both rattle off some things that you're excited about with how the whole ecosystem is coming together around building this vision of impact equals profit and impact tracking, and what are some things that you want to look for. Carl, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So with any impact market, what you're trying to do is create a three-sided marketplace. So on the one hand, you have projects. On the other hand, you have funding. And then ideally, you have some role for however you're deciding how to measure impact or to evaluate the types of impact that you want to see. And so I think a lot of people have tried to do this. It's been very difficult to pull off. And I think the part that we're now seeing real traction is marketplaces where you have solved both the project and the funding side. Optimism RPGF is the best example of this because they have brought significant new funding for impact. And while they're still trying to work out how to do the accounting of what is impact and what is an appropriate way of paying for that impact, what they have done is created a very, very clear demand signal that if you have impact on our ecosystem, you are going to get compensated for it. So I think that anybody who is interested in exploring the space should be looking very closely at what is happening in Optimism, because that is a place right now where there's a good amount of money that is going towards this very problem. The part that obviously I'm most interested in is figuring out, okay, well, given that there's funding and given that there's projects, how do you actually measure impact? How do you see if any of this funding is making a difference? Because I think the worst outcome would be to realize that actually you might as well just distribute all of the money equally, or you might as well use some silly metric like the size of the team or the number of GitHub stars and just distribute all of your money that way. If we don't learn anything that's better than that, then I think we'll all be disappointed. So now that you are seeing real economic experiments that are happening, I think the next level of thinking is going to be brought about by getting smarter at understanding what types of impact are most valued and using that to create really clear signals for projects. If you build in this direction, you are more likely to get rewarded. And what I think is so cool is that we have these composable funding mechanisms where this can be happening every 6 months or every 4 months with Optimism. And at the same time, you can be running smaller, more concentric experiments at Gitcoin. And those two systems are actually strengthening each other. You're building a very, very clear signal of what products are high quality going into, say, a larger Optimism or RPGF round by having a Gitcoin round right before that. And then separately, coming out of it, these projects, the most impactful ones, are going to be better funded. So what are they going to do? What are they going to invest in? I wouldn't be surprised if some actually do their own version of RPGF, where they take that funding and they look at the contributors or the other actors in their ecosystem that have been most helpful to them and do their own version of it. So I really think there's going to be a huge amount of learning and acceleration in this area over the next year. And kind of impact measurement is kind of the least sexy part, but to me, it's the linchpin.
There's this idea, Vitalik actually taught me this term, Keynesian beauty contest. And it means a beauty contest where judges are rewarded for the most popular faces instead of like the best ones. And this is one of the problems that we've always had with quadratic funding over time, is that it kind of selects for the most popular projects instead of the most impactful. So something that's very visible and has a prominent founder and a lot of Twitter followers will receive more funding than something that's down beneath the infrastructure that has a lot of impact, but it's in the plumbing. When we ran a QF round for this beach vacation that I was on with 30 other Web3 people, the example of this was the bartenders got way more funding than the people who are washing the dishes in the back, or like the janitors and stuff like that. So it might be too reductionist, but it feels like we can move from Keynesian beauty contests down to impact equals profit with the less visible public goods there. Jonas, same question to you. What are you excited about in impact season? What should we look for? What are you excited about?
Just riffing on what Carl said, I think it's super exciting to be in an environment where we have a lot of pressure towards solving a problem. And at least I feel like that is the case. I think we've been in this space where this retroactive funding idea has been floating around since forever. We may have pushed this forward like a few years back when we outlined this kind of retroactive public goods funding idea in a blog post. But really, if you think about it, how we haven't made a whole insane amount of progress on solving this problem, because we didn't run rounds and we didn't run rounds fast enough. So it was like essentially Optimism did one experiment in 2021, and then in 2023, we now did 2 rounds. And you can really see, as soon as you do experiments and you actively run them, how it puts pressure on the whole system to solve different aspects of this problem. And so I think agreeing with Carl here, right, like the impact measurement is kind of the big thing to strive for. And that is actually a problem with a bunch of different facets. This goes from everything of like, what data are you collecting to measure impact? What data do you then actually use in your impact measurement calculations? How do you let the voters shape what they think is impactful and what they think is less impactful? So it's essentially becomes a very multifaceted problem that you can approach over like with a variety of designs in mind. And I think what's really interesting that we will hopefully see come together over the next like half year is a bunch of collaborations and experiments that essentially explore the whole space of how these rounds are run, and run like a very much integrated approach. So I think one aspect that we've seen here that was touched on before is for Optimism's RPGF, we had a bunch of different voting tools and data analytics tools, some of which were like commissioned by via an RFP from the Optimism Foundation, but the majority were essentially community built and supported by like grant funding mechanisms. And this really shows, I think, what the interesting aspect behind this is the scope of experimentation can be really large because anybody can just rock up and create a different voting interface that reflects kind of their thinking on the problem. And I think this combination of putting a bunch of pressure to solve a problem, having a community that is really willing to experiment, and having a really flexible way to run these experiments by allowing anybody to essentially add different tools and parts to the process, is something where I hope we see a really like crazy experimental ideas that people experiment with. I think Owocki, to your point of beauty contest like dynamics, we're now really diving into impact measurement. And I think what quadratic funding is actually pretty good at is like getting the impact measurement of a particular crowd, and they vote with their dollars. What is I think taking a slight step back and like, why are we so hyped about now trying to measure impact in this much more kind of data driven way that goes outside of just asking people to vote? Like, why are you so bullish on this, Owocki?
It feels like a area where Gitcoin and Optimism can collaborate. So if we both align on a common standard, whether it's EAS or hypercerts or something else, then it realizes the vision of retroactive public goods funding changing other types of funding. It's an opportunity for us to build the data together and both and receive the data in both types of projects, quadratic funding, Gitcoin grants, and also Optimism, RPGF. So just like the whole Unix philosophy of each ecosystem doing one thing and doing it well, but together, because they're interoperable with each other, they create more value than each individual part can. Like that kind of gets realized. It's a super modular ecosystem in that the sum of it is worth more than its parts. And I think it also solves the Keynesian beauty contest problem of people just funding what they recognize. We could create a long tail of unsexy public goods that don't make a lot of noise, don't have a lot of Twitter followers, that don't shill badge holders, and they'll still get funded because they show up in the data. So to me, it feels like a new frontier, and it's one that, because it's a new frontier, lots of people can contribute to shaping it and to make sure that it happens. And it kind of all starts with education. So that's why we're doing the Green Pill season together. So I don't know. That's my off the cuff on why I'm excited about it. I'm curious if that triggers anything for each of you.
I think kind of, digging into the long tail of public goods meme.
Do you want to explain what that is real quick, Carl, for those of us who don't follow you on Twitter?
Hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, we're going to have done more of a write-up on it. But the basic idea is that you have kind of a power law distribution. And on one end, you have things that are very popular and well-known, and that's the short tail. And then on the other end, you have this very long tail of kind of niche, obscure, more community-focused public goods. So a short tail public good might be an airport. A long tail public good might be your local PTA trying to raise funding to build a new basketball court. And so increasingly what we're able to do through mechanisms like quadratic funding is give things on the long tail global distribution and reach. And so the more you're able to do that, the more there's a chance that they can get not only funding, but signal that they matter and that they're able to move from the long end of the tail up the curve. And what we've seen actually is that there's a number of examples of projects that started out, probably all projects that are now well known in the Ethereum ecosystem, started out as long tail public goods. And because they were able to build and over time get recurring funding and generate signal, they were actually able to move and now become the types of things that we refer to as household public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem. And so I think the more that we're able to use mechanisms like quadratic funding and then have that be a ladder to things like RetroPGF, then the more people are actually going to be able to focus on building public goods as opposed to the next Ponzi.
And that's where I kind of want to end. And I'm actually embarrassed that it took us to the end of the episode to actually get here. When the median new entrant to the ecosystem can make more by creating an open source public good project or any other sort of public good than they can by joining a private good or an ICO, dog coin, meme coin, then we've really shifted the landscape in a way that is profound. And so it starts and ends with the participants in the ecosystem, the agents in the ecosystem being monetarily rewarded for contributing to public goods, being able to pay for their healthcare, for their education, for their childcare, whatever it is that they need in their lives by contributing to public goods. I think is where it starts and it ends for me. And everything else is just sort of a means to that end if you were to take a humanitarian lens on that. So that's for me what impact equals profit, what it means for everyday members of the ecosystem, and where it gets me jazzed about it.
Just riffing on this, totally agree. One aspect, one kind of picture to frame here that I think goes even beyond this is this is a quote from somebody from the Protocol Guild that's in some discussion, which was, "We should normalize the geth devs buying Lambos from retroactive rewards." This is really important. At the end of the year, there should be like somebody doing really weird online brags with like their Lambo saying, "I got this from retroactive funding." Why that is important culturally is currently we look at essentially public goods funding as this donation style way to reward certain behavior or certain contributions. And this often leads to the space where we think about it as essentially like charity, which rewards people that need it the most, right? And it gets us to the space where people that come into the space are walking what you're talking on, and they think about like, should I build this open source public good, or should I jump into this exciting DeFi project? The upside in the DeFi project is super high, right? Like the maximum return they could have on this contribution is super high. While if they focus on the open source project, that is like some developer tooling, the upside is probably much lower, because if they would get anything above a certain amount, everybody would say, okay, we don't need to give more to this open source project because they obviously have enough to cover their costs in building this. And I think what we want to normalize is if you create a lot of impact, that should be super profitable, right? If you're building Geth, that should be, and it has like this big impact on all of us in this big ecosystem, that should be super profitable. And I think this is something we need to get. I think this meme of like normalize buying a Lambo for your work on an Ethereum execution client is something we should really hone in on, because we need to shift. The playing field should be essentially equal, where it's as profitable to work on Geth as it is to start like the next DeFi project. And I think this switch in the landscape is something I'm super excited about, and I will definitely have a big celebration once I see the first Ethereum core dev post this Lambo pic.
Okay, well, maybe that's a meme that we can try to propagate out there. You get Lambos for working on public goods, not just for launching a DeFi project. Let's see. I think we're pretty much out of time. We're at 30 past the hour. Anything I didn't ask that y'all want to say? Carl, I'll go to you first.
I'm good. I think we covered everything.
Yep, everything good from my side.
Okay, well, thank you for helping me kick off Greenpill Impact Season. Huge fans of you both and the impact that you've had on the space, and the impact that you've had on impact in the space, getting meta here. So thanks for doing this episode with me, and see you in 2024.